Hey guys, John here, and welcome back to 100 Sound Design Tips. Today is video 6, and we're going to be talking about filters. And today's video, we're going to go over some basics of the filters, but we're also going to learn some cool tricks just in case you might not know them. So in all things, there's generally 3 main filter types that you need to be aware of. That's going to be a low pass, a high pass, and a band pass. So diving in here to Avenger, let's go to an initialized preset, and we have a basic saw wave here. Right, as we see here, we learned from the previous videos what all of these things are. Now, if we want to kind of take away the brightness of this, we're going to go for a low pass filter. And for most synthesizers, that should be the filter that's on there by default. Low pass meaning it lets the low frequencies pass, or you could call it a high cut. Same thing, but just different terminology here. So now we need to click this cutoff knob and just bring this down here. And we're going to notice that, yes, it gets much darker. Right, this is shaving off the tops going down to the lows, and each filter is going to have something called a slope, so how steep that filter cutoff goes. So right now we're on a low pass 12, so 12 dB per octave. We can go a little bit higher here, so we can go to an 18. So this right down here is going to be much steeper. Let's freeze this real quick. So this is going to be much steeper than the 12 was, and if we go over to the 24, we can see this is even steeper as well. And depending on the synthesizer that you have, some might have steeper filters or much less steeper. So what's cool here in Avenger, we have this one called the one pole low pass 6, which is actually quite gentle. And I find the gentler slopes, kind of like this, really work well on natural types of instruments. Or even if you're emulating something or you have a sample that you bring into your synth, this can be kind of a good one to go for. Or if you're doing maybe some type of overall kind of filter, so if you have a whole thing going on. So let's say, for example, we have a drum sequencer going on. Let's go for this one here. Something kind of like that. Let's make a quick little patch here. Bring up the unison. Let's turn on the ARP, and maybe let's pick something kind of... That should work for now. Something kind of like that here. Maybe a delay. Maybe another voice here at the top, just in case. Okay, we have something like this here, and we can go to the master filter. And a lot of the times, as this is default here, it's probably intentional, but it's nice to use something like this overall, which includes the drums here. Kind of get that outside of the club kind of feeling, like there's something cool going on somewhere on the other side of this building, and you're like, what is going on there? You kind of get closer, and then you open the door, right? Start dancing to it, whatever it is you do at those places. But anyway, that's a very gentle curve here. So let's go back to an initialized preset and back to our main menu here. So we have this low pass filter, right? Letting the lows pass, cutting the highs. Now the inverse is going to be, you guess it, a high pass. So here in Avenger, we have lots of different versions of these. So let's go to the ones that we were looking at. So the Anna ones here. So if we have this selected and we play some notes here, we might notice, okay, all this stuff is getting cut off, but remember the filter cutoff knob is going to go the opposite direction. So we actually want to start over here, and it lets all the signal through. As soon as we start turning this upwards, it starts taking out the lows and then leaving us with the highs, hence high pass lets the highs pass. And this is a kind of a gentle one. This is a 12 here. So if we scroll here with our scroll wheel, let's make this just a little bit bigger here, maybe 95 for now, because we still want to look at this the graph here. So we're on 18. Then we can switch out to a 24. You can see that's steeper, and so on and so forth. So this might not on the surface seem like a kind of an important thing, but the more patches that you do, the more instruments that you create and things like that, these slopes will be a drastic change to that sound. So we have these low pass and then the high pass. Now, what would happen if we essentially combine the two? So you're kind of taking out the lows and the highs and leaving somewhere in the middle, and that's going to be a band pass. So it's letting this band pass through, which is what we're going to hear. So in this case, let's maybe add a little bit. You know what? We're going to do resonance in just a bit here since we're doing the saw wave. So we have band passes go again to the Anna band pass 12, and we can kind of see as we're moving this around, this is affecting both sides. Now it's rather smooth, so let's go maybe to a 24. So it's almost kind of like sweeping a certain area of that of the signal. Now, this is where resonance really starts to come in here. So this is going to be the next knob that really works in tandem with your filter cutoff. As soon as we start increasing this, wherever that point is, it's going to accentuate that as well. Let's bring this over a little bit right here. So this point right here, let's do a freeze. So this area right here is going to be this resonance spot here. So let's unfreeze it and kind of play around with this knob here. You know what I'm saying? And these get really important depending on the style of music that we're trying to make here. So this accentuates that peak for the band pass. Now what happens if we do that for a low pass? So we go back down here to, let's say, a regular and a low pass 12. Let's bring this down. So we're about somewhere here-ish or so. And as soon as we start increasing this, we can see that peak here, this right over here, and we can also hear the kind of like kind of sound, right? And like I said, depending on the type of patch you're going to make, maybe you're going to want a lot of resonance. So for example, something in like an acid patch, or maybe you want something a little bit gentler. Maybe you're doing a bass, but you want a little bit of that resonance in there. So this is going to be the spot where we kind of look at some cool tricks here. So one thing that's kind of nice is that when you send signal through a filter, you get these filter characteristics of it, and they're all different. So it's not like a one size fits all, like this is a low pass filter at 12 dB per octave, 24 dB per octave, whatever it is. And that's what it's going to sound like. Each one has their own sound, their own nuance to it. So that's why using different types of filters on different sounds is kind of a cool concept, because they can all give you an entirely different result, and the way the resonance interacts with the cutoff. It's all different, and that's kind of the charm of synthesis within itself. And something I always kind of like to reiterate is that filters themselves are a crucial spot in any synthesizer. There's some synths out there that can have okay oscillators. The effects, they can be kind of okay, but the filter has got to be good. That's one of the things that are most sought after, because they just have that character to them. So thinking of that, there's some cool tricks that we can do. So let's say, for example, we are maybe making a, let's do this here. I'll kind of show you this in action. Let's go to initialize here. And let's say we want to make kind of this typical bass that we generally make on this channel here. So we have a saw wave. Maybe we can do it in this octave. We're not going to change any of the transpose. So we're going to give ourselves some unison. So adding more voices here and bring down the panel. We don't want this too stereo. Okay, and then now we're on a low pass. Now for this, I'm going to do a low pass 24, and we're going to bring this down here to make a bass. We don't really want all those high frequencies in there. Something kind of like that. So now if we want to maybe make this a bass ARP for now, or you could play it individually, depends on how you want to do it. But let's send it to an ARP. And we hear this repeating of this note. You're kind of this low end, but it's kind of boring that it's kind of just stuck. It's cutting off those frequencies and it's just staying stationary. So now we want to do something with modulation here. And luckily enough, Avenger has this envelope knob right here. And this is basically saying this envelope shape that we talked about before for amplitude, those same controls, attack, hold, decay, sustain, and release, also applies to how this knob here moves. So remember when we talked about the amplitude envelope, how that's affecting the volume contour of the sound. In this case, it's the same parameters, but it's just affecting this knob right here. So think of this as the volume was in the previous video that we talked about. So this envelope knob here is going to accentuate, or it's going to give the depth, how much of this envelope should influence this knob. And as we turn this to the right, we can start to see that this cutoff knob is kind of just going back and forth every time a note is getting struck. So if we took it off the ARP, that's kind of what it's doing. But since we're having this ARP trigger these notes, it's going to hit those notes repeatedly. So here is no resonance, right? And if we add just a little bit here, take a listen to that sound. It's a small move, around 5%, but if we go further, we kind of get that sound. Now for this type of bass here, I would generally maybe keep this no more than 6. Generally 5 is kind of the sweet spot I find for this if you are using Avenger as well. And then the bass frequency spot that we want to keep this at, we can move this cutoff knob. And if we want to get a little bit more of those highs in, we're going to crank this envelope a little bit more. Something kind of like that. And if we look at this on the spectrum, we're right over here. This is our low end here, and this is the highs kind of coming in as well. So here's some cool tricks. So we have this going on. Let's first make this sound kind of cool here. I'm not going to boost the low end here like I usually do. I want to show you a trick for that, but I'm going to take out some of the mud that I don't really like. That stuff. Let's take a little bit of that out. But be careful with this because this is somewhere maybe around 130, maybe 200 hertz. It kind of depends on the key, the note that you're playing the bass, and it can be a little bit different. So it's around that area, but don't take too much of that out because it can really just destroy the entire bass. So this is what I'm talking about. Now it just kind of sounds lifeless. So if we went back to 0 and just took out a little bit, that should be okay for now. And let's give it a little bit of compression here, maybe like a ratio of 8 or so. Okay, this is kind of a good spot to start in. Now, since Avenger is so, not really complex, I should say, but it's so feature rich that I don't necessarily use this trick all the time in here, but depending on the synth that you're using, this can be a very useful thing. So let's say we have this bass, right? We like it, but let's say we want to get a little bit more oomph out of it, right? And we remember that the resonance can really create that little bump somewhere. So it might sound counterintuitive, but if we put a high pass onto this type of sound and then crank the resonance, it will give us a little nice boost in the low end, and it also gives us the characteristics of that filter. So here, let's go ahead and do that. Let's add another filter, so filter 2 here, and in our routing, let's select this plus here, and let's go to filter 2, and this is going to be right under filter 1. So we're first going to filter 1, and then after this comes out here, it goes right into filter 2. So what we heard, the output of that is going into the next filter, which we're going to change to a high pass. So we'll click here, and we'll go to a high pass, and let's do something like an 18, for example. And then if we play some notes, we don't hear anything, because remember, this goes the other way around. So if we have this all the way open, and maybe we can bring this a little bit down like that here. And once we start cranking this resonance, we're essentially boosting this cutoff point, and we can move the cutoff to find that really nice low end oomph. Let's kind of do something drastic here. And if we look here like this, look, this area right here, it's kind of high up right now, but this is going to be the target area that we want to maybe find for that bass. Something kind of like that. So this is kind of excessive, and that's the point, just to kind of let you hear that. So let's try out some other filters. One of my favorites is going to be these vintage ones. So let's check out the 24 and see how that would sound. So right there, if we mute the filter, and then let's unmute it. Now, hopefully you have headphones for this because it's quite apparent in headphones. If you have kind of maybe smaller speakers or you're listening on a laptop, you're not going to notice this, so keep that in mind. So with a filter and without it. Now, this is a really cool trick to do on lots of different types of synthesizers because some of them might not necessarily have a really nice built-in EQ like this here that you can just add as many EQs as you really want to. Some of them are in that sense limiting, so you kind of have to be creative to really get that low-end juice or that boost out there. And you also get, like I said, the characteristics of that filter and the resonance, so it can all be a cool thing. And especially in Avenger, we have this. Let's actually make this a little bit bigger so you can see what I'm talking about. So on this vintage filter, which is one of my favorites in here, we have this thing called mod. And if we hover our mouse over this here, it says this makes the cutoff and resonance a bit more unstable to emulate analog behavior, which is a really cool feature. If I'm ever going for any type of, inspired analog sounds or kind of just unpredictability, randomness, that whole sort of thing, this is definitely a go-to filter, increasing this mod here and then kind of sweeping around through this resonance. Can be some cool stuff. So I'll show you here. Let's do a real initialized patch in a second. And let's say we have, let's first try it on a saw wave. Let's go back to our filter and we go to our low pass and let's do the 24. And let's bring this back up here. And maybe let's bring the size down so we can kind of see it here. Because it's one thing to hear, but it's also another to see it here on the scope. So with that being said, we have our filter maybe right around here. Let's give us some resonance. So that's what this is going to sound like. This mod is at 0. And as we start increasing this, we get this interesting texture, this, as it says, unpredictability, this weird tones that get added to it. And we can see that as well in the graph. So let's listen again and I'll remove this mod here. That little change down over here. It almost sounds like we can see here, there's almost like this other tone here. So if we brought this up again, let's freeze it here. So this section right here, it almost looks like this guy right here is getting added to the signal, which is kind of interesting. So if we brought this back down to 0, and let's unfreeze this and play the same note, we can see how different that sounds again. So let's freeze it here and let's add this back. So 40, something like that. And let's play it again and listen. We can see how different that actually looks and sounds. So things like that can really enhance stuff. So that's kind of one thing Avenger specific in this case, but there's also other cool things that you can do with the filter and the cutoff. So another example, sometimes filter resonance can get so high that it starts to feed back. And that is kind of an interesting process because we can make sounds with that. And not every filter is going to do that. Some of them do, so you kind of have to be careful with this. So, for example, if we turn this resonance up all the way here, we get kind of that high-pitched sound. I'm going to turn this down just a bit here. We get that. However, if we do some other filters, like let's say, for example, again, the vintage, let's do the 24. Let's bring this down just a bit more. You see this tone here? We can kind of get something pretty cool like that. And even if we just sent like a sine wave through it, as we move the cutoff, we have this kind of tone here. And if we did some key tracking, so every time we hit a key, it's going to move this filter, which is another thing we're going to talk about here as well. We can see that this is moving via key tracking, which is actually kind of interesting. And if we take out that sine wave, we're just left with this tone. And then here, since we're moving this, we're essentially tuning this note. So this resonance that's happening with this filter, this cutoff knob now becomes the pitch control, which is very interesting. And if we did something like this with the Ana and we started playing some stuff, we notice we don't really get anything because the filter is doing this work for us. So back here to the vintage, we can check out the 24 as well. And we can also maybe add some drive. What would that sound like? Ooh, we get some more overtones there. Look at that. So why is this cool in that sense? That we can have this unique sound get created through the filter, but then again, how do we tune this? And a way to do it, you can, I think it's like 263? Something like that, if I remember correctly, or 261. But if we don't know offhand, what we could do is we could add another filter like this here, and maybe instead of sending this to filter 1, which is kind of redundant, we can switch it to filter 2. And we play these tones and we say, okay, these two are out of pitch here. And we could go again for a sine wave, right? And for the first filter, we can move this, and we can kind of match this not only with our eyes, but also with our ears, obviously. And then have them tuned together. So now we know that this is going to be in tune. So what is this exactly here? 163. That was it. 60 something. So now we can do this here. So this is basically in tune. If we mute the second one, we have this kind of tone. Maybe add some more drive. And now we can have a patch created from our filter, and we can make this even cooler here. Maybe we can add an EQ if we want to do stuff, maybe some compression here a little bit if we need it. And that's not going to work here, right? So if we're ever going to go for vibrato, this won't necessarily work for this patch. You'd actually have to do it here on the cutoff. A little quick demo here. This might sound a little bit weird. However, that's going to be kind of how you're going to have to do it. Let's go to hertz here. Maybe it's like 6. And this may be a little bit too much, so let's do like 0.5. That's going to be what it does. And then if you want to go like an octave up here, you're going to have to look at this number here, 163, multiply that by 2. You can go really in depth to do the decimal, I suppose, if you want to. But maybe there's a charm of it not being exactly tuned. And sometimes this kind of patch is cool to do with like an air piano or something like that. I'd like to take off the vibrato for this real quick. So we have this sound. And then maybe we could do a little bit of EQ here. And sculpt it a little bit more. And then maybe add some nice, maybe some root-a-verb on maybe like a cathedral setting here. That might be kind of interesting. Yeah, so that's kind of a interesting concept. And again, not every filter can do that, but if it can, which, you know, some of them do, it can be a really cool way to make a patch there. So that's one thing as well. And this has to do with key tracking, which we're going to talk about here. Let's initialize this one more time. Now, some filters come by default with key tracking on, some of them have it off. But essentially what it is that if we have this filter down over here, and let's do some resonance, so it's kind of obvious. We have something kind of going here. Now, if I move replace some different notes. The filter is stationary. It doesn't move. It's just, this is the frequency zone that it stays in and is locked in that sense. Now, if we have the key tracking to 100%, so all the way, as we start moving up the keyboard, so here's low and here's high. Notice how the filter, let's bring this down a little bit, it's kind of loud. Notice how the filter is going to move depending on if we play a low pitch note or a high pitch note. So that's going to be key tracking. And generally, when you use just a little bit of this, it can be kind of nice to maybe make an ARP, and the higher that you go, the filter opens up a little bit more. The lower that you go, it kind of closes a little bit. It's kind of a cool feature. Some synthesizers actually do this in a negative fashion. So you can go 0 to 100 positive, which is what we did, but you can also go the other way. So the lower the notes get, the higher the filter goes, and then the higher it goes, the opposite, right? So that's kind of the concept behind that. So another cool thing with resonance here, let's go to initialize again, is that in different types of situations, like for example, like an acid patch, the resonance is a super huge characteristic of what that is going to sound like. So let's say, for example, we have this saw wave. Let's take out a little bit of that fundamental there. And let's maybe send this to an ARP and find a cool patch for this. So I think was it in Cyberpunk 1? Was it acidized? Okay, so that might be kind of cool. And for this, I'll probably do like a 24, something like that. Give it a good amount of resonance. So that sound just in there, and that's no distortion or effects or anything like that, which we can. We're going to make this a little bit cooler, but just notice that sound with this resonance and then without. And just how these filters work is really one reason why the 303 was so iconic, is just how that sounded, how the resonance sounded. And then here I'm kind of changing this to K, so making this this curve a little bit longer, so not as curved in here, so this doesn't kind of modulate away too fast. So we have something like this here. So now let's say, let's add some of the traditional stuff that we have in there. So this is, again, the first kind of step. It's a saw wave, a little bit less of the fundamental here, and just going through a filter with some modulation, which we saw through the ARP, which is a kind of a cool pattern here. And then most of the work is going to be this resonance. And we could add some drive to the filter. We'll see what that sounds like. Which is kind of cool. And also, if you have Avenger, in the low pass section at the down here, we have TB low pass 18, which is that filter. And we can really crank this resonance here. I found that this version of the filter and also the Anna 24 can also sound really good for acid patches. So let's kind of make this a little bit cooler, and let's add a shaper here. And let's bring this below the filter, something like that. And we can stay on soft and just start cranking this here. Now this would be a cool knob to modulate, and we already have the filter doing that already, so we can just use this same modulation source right here on the frequency and kind of find the sweet spot and the modulation depth here. Okay, that can be kind of cool. So furthermore, we can maybe add maybe we can do some compression here, bring this down just in case. And then some distortion. We kind of always need a little bit of that. Kind of a cool spot. And then let's go maybe add a little bit of delay. Let's see what that other one sounds like as well. And maybe increase our tempo. Maybe let's do something like 130. And then add some drums here. What does the cyber kit sound like? Let's do a little higher pitch here. So that can already sound pretty cool. It almost has this kind of throaty sound to it, so just without the drums here. And that's part of what I'm saying, is that how these filters just sound different, how the resonance interacts with it, it can all be kind of cool. So this is the version with the TB version. So let's bring this resonance down and try out the Anna once more. And again, I think they both sound cool, just a little bit different. And then a little bit of some drums here. And then maybe we can add a little bit of reverb to this as well here. Let's go to the Rootverse, one of my favorites. And then with ARPs, we kind of do have to be careful with how long this decay is going to, because it can get pretty dirty. Maybe the pre-delay, let's do something like 14. And we could add another voice here at the top. Let's see what that sounds like as well. So that's kind of just the basics of some type of acid patch. And again, it all really has to do with the filters, right? Even if we disabled these guys here, which we could do that as well, but we still have a little bit of that distortion through the shaper here. But that's really the filter and the resonance doing that by itself. If we added everything back here, like this, and let's bring in our shaper again. Now let's bring our resonance all the way down. It's cool, but it's not as cool. So yeah, that's kind of a cool thing as well. And before we kind of let go here, so we talked about kind of the bass here. We did this acid patch now. What's really nice about filters is that they can move slowly to kind of make something sound interesting. So if we had all these saws here, let's increase this mix. Something like this, maybe do a couple notes. A little higher up here. Right, so we had something like this. Now, if we did something like with a filter, that slow motion there can be really cool. So let's give it some release here. And let's make this nice real quick so you can kind of see this example in action. We can probably high pass this a little bit. Maybe add maybe some delay here. And then some reverb. And for this, we can actually do a little bit of shimmer. A nice little pitch up there. Okay, so we have our filter, and let's say we want to have this kind of slowly move and just kind of not staying stationary, but just move slowly with this sound and increase our attack, something like this. Now, just that type of thing can really make something like that shine. And again, that's going through the filter and kind of keeping that moving. And this is going to also have to deal with modulation, which we're going to talk about this soon. So let's put a quick LFO on here and maybe modulate this a little bit, which obviously this is going to be too fast. So we need to slow this puppy down. Just that motion right there. And let's say we don't want to go above and below, so a bipolar signal, then we can just crank this to the right, and we're just going to go above this line here. So we can do this all day, and maybe at some point, this curve gets a little boring because it just goes up and down, just like our lives, right? So we can go to something random. We can hold this note all day, and it's always going to be changing. And that's part of what makes the filter interesting. And even if we pick something different, some of these Nexus ones are really cool as well. So let's go for the 12. Can be kind of nice. Start meditating to that. So yeah, this is kind of the overall basics of filters. Now, once you kind of understand this and kind of internalize all that, then you can start getting into some more complex types of filtering, like comb filters, which maybe we'll talk about that at some point. It is a little bit more advanced, making patches with those. It is a lot of fun though, but there's a lot of cool stuff you can do with that. You know, making stuff like strings. You can do a lot of cool metallic sounds with those as well. So that's something. And if you also have Avenger here in the special category, there's a lot of cool stuff here to kind of go through and play around with. I do highly recommend playing with the talk box. That is a fun filter to play with. But yes, so that's kind of the overall basics. We got the low pass, letting the lows pass, taking the highs out, cutting the highs. Got the high pass, letting the highs pass and cutting the lows. And then we have a band pass, which is kind of just both those filters kind of doing the same thing and honing in on a certain area and increasing the resonance to bring that out a little bit. And one, I guess we should kind of just briefly mention here is this band stop, which is essentially the inverse of a band pass, right? The band pass cuts the lows and kind of has its peak. The other one is kind of inverted, right? So we can stop a certain band going through, and that can be kind of a cool sound as well. You know, it's helpful if you're maybe doing some type of wind sounds or just interesting, I guess, processing to different sounds. So I guess if you want to do some homework here, whatever synth that you have, experiment with a filter, the different resonance spots, kind of see how it interacts with each other, send different signals through it. And if you do have a drive knob, kind of just play with all of those and really get to know your filter, because at its core, a synthesizer's filter is kind of its heart in a certain way. At least that's my opinion of it. The filters have to sound good, and if they don't, it's kind of like, what's the point? So that is all for today. That is a very brief overview of filters. And yeah, thank you for watching and hanging out, and we'll see you in the next one.